Welcome, Ralph, back to Esoteric Thoughts.
Good to be back with you again. Yes, another interesting little session, I think.
Yes, today we're going to be talking about Adam and Eve.
Yes, so what shall we say about Adam and Eve? Well, this was a very difficult topic for me to research. So I left this almost until last, because when you read Genesis, it's so mythological that it's difficult to think you could ever find anything historical within it. So I just didn't bother with it for a long, long time. And then I came back to it after I had done a lot of research on Egypt, and I've been looking at the Amana dynasty of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And I revisited this Genesis story because I'd begun to see some similarities here. And you did a video recently, I think, on Psalm 22, is it? The hymn to the Arton.
On 104.
104, that's the one. And Psalm 104 is a copy of the hymn to the Arton by Pharaoh Akhenaten, supposed to be written by himself as well. We don't know, but there we go. And so we do see some similarities between the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten and the biblical texts, because the biblical texts have actually copied his hymn to the Arton. So anyway, I started looking through Genesis, and again, things started popping out that were familiar. And the first of those was the description of Eden itself. And it says, and a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from then it was parted into 4 branches. Genesis 2, 2 verse 10. Now that was interesting because there is only one river in this region completely that actually does that, and that's the River Nile. The River Nile runs through the Garden of Egypt, the strip oasis, they sometimes call it, of the River Nile. And when it gets to Cairo, it splits into 4 branches. So the description is perfect for Egypt, not for, Mesopotamia, where everybody thinks these rivers should be, but it's perfect for Egypt. And of course, the rest of my books were pointing back towards Egypt anyway, for the Old Testament events. All of the early events from the Torah all stem from Egypt. So it was natural to have a look at what Egypt was saying about this particular story. And then, of course, other things start popping out as well. So Eden, the actual name for Eden, can be translated as Aten, because the Aten, the god of Pharaoh Akhenaten, is called the Aten, but that god name is spelt with a reed glyph, and the reed glyph is more accurately pronounced as an E rather than A. So the god is called Eten, and he should be called Pharaoh Akhenaten, not Akhenaten. So we have a god name of Eten, or Eden, because sometimes it's spelt with a D instead of a T. So we have a god name that is Eden in Egypt, which is where the river with 4 branches runs. And furthermore, we have a Garden of Eden because, well, we have the River Nile itself, the oasis of the River Nile. And we have the Nile Delta, which can be considered a garden as well. But also, all of the pharaohs built temples and gardens to the god. So Pharaoh Akhenaten had a large garden to his god Eden. So it was the Garden of Eden. And these gardens, it wasn't just Egypt, of course, they had them over in Mesopotamia. And in Mesopotamia, they are called a paradise, which is where we get the word from. So they were a paradise. They were an oasis of nature in the middle of the desert. And it was known as the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Eden. So there are similarities there. And so I started looking at this sort of more deeply. And of course, the first thing you notice is that Adam and Eve were the first man and the first woman. And that's probably why this story has been jammed at the beginning of the Torah, which is, I don't think, where it should actually be. But someone looked at this and it looked like a creation epic with the first man and the first woman. And so they put this story at the beginning of the Bible. But I don't think that's where it belongs. Because Akhenaten and Nefertiti were also the first man and the first woman. It's a royal title. The same as in America, the president and his wife are the first man and the first lady. It's exactly the same, so you can misinterpret these things. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti were the first man and the first woman. But obviously in titular terms, not in real terms. Furthermore, this first man and this first woman always strolled naked through the Garden of Eden, because that is what Nefertiti and Akhenaten did. They are pretty much always portrayed as being naked as they walk around their garden, as they're giving out awards. They were the original naturists. They're always pictured as being naked. And I don't know how surprising this was for Egyptians, but I mean, this would be like, you know, a golden jubilee, you know, for the Queen of England, for the Queen of Great Britain. And she comes out onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace naked, because that is exactly how they are portrayed in Amana. They stand at the window of appearances, this big window where they stand out giving awards to the people, and they're standing there naked, giving out these golden necklaces to the people down below. So yeah, we would have to have Prince Philip and the Queen of Britain naked on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, handing out awards. It would be shocking now. Was it shocking then? I don't know, but that's. Amana was a funny place. It was a little cult center, and they did cult things. You know, they were in tune with nature, and that's what they did. And I don't know, did I mention this before with the cult in America?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, I'm just looking it up because I don't want to get the name wrong. There was Rajneesh, there we go. The Rajneesh cult, because sometimes it's difficult to get a grasp on this history, and it's difficult to actually envisage what was going on. But if you want to know what Amana was like and what they were doing, just have a read of the Rajneesh cult community that set themselves up in Wasco County in Oregon, in America. So this was a spiritual teacher, I suppose you would call him, and from India. And he had this cult following in India, and he decided to set up a new city in America, exactly the same as Pharaoh Akhenaten set up his new city in the center of Egypt. And they had to do exactly the same thing. They had to build a new city. They had to build a new culture, a new society, all from scratch, with all of these followers coming to join this, this spiritual leader setting up this place. And then, of course, they had the same problems. They had, internal disputes and petty hatreds, and all sorts of things were going on. And then they started persecuting, I don't know if you would call it, the local community, because the local community were against them. And so they started fighting against the local community, and they poisoned, I mean, that's how ridiculous it got. They went to the local town and poisoned all the people in the local town. It got really bizarre. And that is pretty much what happened to Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They had this wonderful cult community that they had set up in Middle Egypt, which was totally separate from the rest of Egypt, with different gods. They were trying to outlaw the old gods, and they succeeded in the end. They cut all of the old gods out of Egypt. But then their new society, based on this idealism of all its followers, was really powerful to start with. But then, they had internal disputes and problems, and it finally sort of fell apart. These two cults follow each other all the way through. So if you want to know what it was like to be Pharaoh Akhenaten or be one of his followers, this would have been circa 1340 BC, something of that nature. Just watch the video. What was it called? It was a Netflix one. It was called Wild, Wild Country, 2018 Netflix video. And it follows the setting up of this cult city in America, and the way it failed and dissolved it back into nothing. And it gives you an exact idea of what it would be like to be in Amana in 1340 BC. So that's the Amana dynasty. And of course, as I was saying, like some of these cult centers, they used to stroll naked through the Garden of Eden. So we have some great similarities with the biblical story. And you can take it further, because Nefertiti herself was always pictured with the W. Reyes, they called it, the twin snakes. So she was always pictured with the two snakes, which was a symbol of power within Egypt. And then, as we were talking about with that other cult, their cult failed eventually. It only lasted for about 20, 25 years, something of that nature. And then the Amana experiment failed. And so Akhenaten and Nefertiti were actually exiled from the Garden of Eden, exactly as the story says. And of course, when they were exiled, they had to go out into, because they'd never really been out, they weren't really allowed out of Amana, because the rest of the country didn't exactly appreciate these people changing their religion, dominating the whole of Egypt. So they'd been in this bubble of Amana in the middle of Egypt for like 20 years. But when they were exiled out of Amana, they had to cover up. They had to put clothes on, and they went into exile. Now, you'll find a lot, if you read about this in historical books, they'll say that, Akhenaten died in Amana, and that was the end of the dynasty. There is no evidence that Nefertiti or Akhenaten died in Amana. They built tombs there. The tombs were unfinished. There are no other tombs that are definitively identified as the tomb of Akhenaten. They talk about KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings, but that is not Akhenaten. It's too young to be Akhenaten. And so it's likely that he was thrown out on an exile. And actually, we have that information from Manetho. So we have a 3rd century BC Egyptian historian who actually spoke Egyptian, so he has a distinct advantage on us. And he wrote about this era and the Amana dynasty. And he says that they were thrown out of Middle Egypt, and they went to Avaris up in the Nile Delta, which is Pyramisi. And so he went on an exodus, exactly the same as Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Okay, so there is no evidence that Akhenaten actually died in Amana. And we have these comments from Manetho, who is a 3rd century BC historian, who actually spoke Egyptian, so he has an advantage on us. And he says of these people who set up this cult center in the center of Egypt, when it ended, it says, it was also reported that the priest who ordained their politics and laws was by birth of Heliopolis, and his name was Ososeph, from Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis. But then when he was gone over to these people, his name was changed and he was called Moses. So we have an account by Manetho that links this story back into the biblical story. And for the beginning of this Amana cult, Manetho also says Pharaoh Amenephis, that's Amenhotep III, who is the father of Akhenaten. Pharaoh Amenephis employed Amenephis of Papis, who was his scribe and his prime minister, effectively, got together all of those in Egypt that had any defects in their bodies, numbering 80,000, and sent them to the quarries which are on the east bank of the Nile, that they may work in them and might be separated from the rest of the Egyptians. Quarries on the east bank of the Nile. So if we look at it, because Amenephis was the father of Akhenaten, and he's getting these people who he says had defects in their bodies, they were lepers, he calls them, being sent down to work in the quarries on the east bank of the Nile. That is a good description of Amana when it was set up. You've got to imagine that when they went down to Amana, there was nothing there. So the whole place was turned into a quarry. They were quarrying bricks to make the temples, the palace, and the houses and the city and everything. And they were called lepers because they weren't real lepers, of course, because they had a different religion. They were theological lepers and maimed priests because they were not standard Egyptian priests. They followed this new cult of Amana, the cult of the god Aten. And so we have this description from Manetho of the setting up of the Amana cult in Middle Egypt. But then he goes on to say that they only kept this for 13 years, and then they were exiled. They went out of Amana and they were sent up to Avaris. Manetho says of this, after those that were sent to work in the quarries continued in that miserable state for a long while, the king, that's Amenhotep III, was desired that he would set apart the city of Avaris, which was then desolate, as for their habitation and protection. So they were going to be thrown out of the what he calls the quarries on the east bank of the Nile, and go to Avaris, which is up in the Nile Delta. That is Pyramisi, the famous Pyramisi from the Torah. So it's quite clear from the history by Manetho that Akhenaten didn't die in Amana. He was sent out on an exodus, and he went to Pyramisi. And that's where we get this link with the Exodus story that we were talking about in a previous talk, because this is part of the Exodus story. That's why the leader of this group, I don't know why my computer is going quite so slow, was called Moses. As Manetho said, it is said that the priest of this group who framed their constitution and their laws was a native of Heliopolis named Osaseph, after the god Osiris. He worshipped at Heliopolis, but when he joined his people, he changed his name and was then called Moses. And so that's, again, it's a part of the Exodus story. So really, if we're looking at the Genesis story, it should really be a part of the Exodus story. It should be the end of the Exodus story, is this story about Amana and the Exodus out of Amana. Remember when we were talking about the Exodus story, that there were two Exoduses. There was the great Exodus of the Hyksos who were thrown out of Egypt. That's the one that everybody remembers. And then the second one was the smaller Exodus of the 80,000 maimed priests and lepers who were thrown out of Amana. And what the biblical story has done is they've joined these two Exoduses up. They've conflated them into one story. And so when you're reading Exodus, you have to sort of separate one from the other because they're all intertwined. So yeah, that was my investigation of Amana and the Exodus story. And you might ask, well, what is the Genesis story then? Why do we have this Genesis story as a part of this story of Adam and Eve, of Akhenaten and Nefertiti? Well, because it's been misinterpreted. It's not a Genesis story. It's the hymn to the Arton. So if you read the hymn to the Arton in its broad aspects, it's about the dawning of a new day. It's not about the creation of the world. It's about a new day. So the sun comes up over the horizon and all of the animals start to wake up and stretch their wings and start to chirp and move about, you know, at the dawn of the new day. And that is essentially the Genesis story. Someone has obviously read this story and thought, well, that sounds like a creation epic. So we're going to throw that at the beginning of the Bible because it sounds like a creation epic. It wasn't. It was the hymn to the Arton. It was a prayer to the new day that was probably actually said and sung, because they used to sing these prayers. It was sung to the dawn of the new day. And that was the Genesis story. And that's what's been mistranslated and put into Genesis. So yes, strange as it may seem, Adam and Eve are actually Akhenaten and Nefertiti.
So where would the Sumerian stories of Enkidu and Shemhat, who have a similar Adam and Eve-like story origin, where would that originate from?
I have this suspicion that the mother of all societies and history is actually Egypt. And a lot of these stories migrated into Mesopotamia. Everybody says, so I'm a bit alone on this, everybody says that everything started in Mesopotamia. and then it eventually ended up in Egypt. I don't believe that is true, because if you're looking for original societies, you're looking for megaliths, and there are no megaliths in Mesopotamia. The megaliths are in Egypt. They're at the Assyrian, they are at Giza. And I think that most of these stories started in Egypt and actually migrated out elsewhere. A classic one is the Gilgamesh story, which everyone says is a very, very ancient story from Mesopotamia, from Sumer. But the Gilgamesh story is actually a story about the precession of the equinox, the change from Taurus to Aries, which happened in about 1750 BC. So we're going back to the Exodus story again, the same as we talked about the precession of the equinox during the Exodus as being one of the causes of the biblical Exodus. So the Gilgamesh story is a story about Gilgamesh, who stands with his axe and his shield and his sword hanging between from his belt, trying to kill the bull of heaven. So who's the bull of heaven? Well, that's quite obviously that's Taurus. And Orion, sorry, I'm giving the game away. Gilgamesh standing there with his sword and his shield and his sword hanging from his belt is obviously an image of Orion, the image that you've got standing behind you there in the image. But before Gilgamesh can kill the bull of heaven, he has to kill the Humbaba, the 7 splendors of the Humbaba. So what's that a reference to? It's got to be the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, a very well-known constellation of stars. And where does the Pleiades sit? It sits on the neck of Taurus. So Gilgamesh is trying to kill the Humbaba, which protects the neck of Taurus, so he can then kill the bull of heaven and usher in the new processional age of Aries. So this dates us exactly to 1750 BC. So this story is not as old as they say it is. And more than that, it's the same story as we find in the Jacob story, pretty much. Sorry, not the Jacob, the Joseph story that we were talking about in a previous lecture, where they were talking about Taurus and Aries, the bulls and the sheep. A lot of this information is exactly the same as we find it in Egypt. And I think myself that Egypt was the originator. And a lot of this information flowed out into Mesopotamia, in which case we shouldn't really be looking to Mesopotamia for the start of the Genesis story. We should be looking more towards Egypt. Because of course, Mesopotamia has the same story about, the flood and, the baby on the ark, in the flood waters and all of that sort of business. Again, very, very close links to the Moses story. But I think the originator of these stories was in Egypt first, and those stories went out towards Mesopotamia. I mean, I could be wrong on that, but I think that's how it actually worked. And so, yeah, the origins of the gospel story come from Egypt, not from Mesopotamia. After all, that's where these people were. They were there in Egypt as the Israelites, even if you only believe the biblical story, but they were there in Egypt as the Hyksos, because as we said before, the Israelites were the Hyksos, and they lived in Egypt from circa something like 2000 BC all the way to the Exodus, which was in 1670. Let's get this right, 1570 BC. So they were there for several centuries before they were kicked out in the first Exodus. And so they would have picked up an awful lot of information an awful lot of traditions from Egypt before they went out on their exodus. And then they took that information and those stories and that history out to all of the regions where they were exiled to. So yeah, that's my understanding of the Genesis story. I've written a whole book on that. That's called Eden in Egypt. It goes into a lot of the similarities between Israel and Egypt as well. So I've got a dictionary in there, a Hebrew Egyptian dictionary, because it's my understanding that Hebrew Aramaic is a daughter language of Egyptian. Again, this is a heresy. People won't talk about it. But if you think about it, they were in Egypt for 400 years. Do people think they weren't speaking Egyptian? Of course they were speaking Egyptian. And with Egypt being the dominant society, however strong their own society was, with Egypt being the dominant society, of course they're going to speak the dominant language. Just as immigrants going to America will speak English, or coming to Europe, they'll speak a European language. Of course, the Israelites would have spoken Egyptian. Otherwise, they couldn't have operated in that part of the world, especially with people like, Joseph being the prime minister of Egypt, the second in command to Pharaoh. You don't become the second in command to Pharaoh if you can't speak Egyptian and be totally familiar with the society and the religion of Egypt. Of course, Joseph must have been thoroughly Egyptian. Same with Moses, who was supposed to be a prince of Egypt. You don't become a prince of Egypt if you cannot speak Egyptian. And the question then comes did they retain any other language other than Egyptian? I don't think they did. The end of 400 years, and then of course they came back into Egypt and they went back out of Egypt. They'd been on and off. They'd been in Egypt for at least 600 years, maybe more. I think their language by the end of that was thoroughly Egyptian. Maybe with an accent, maybe with some oddities like going to New York and having all of the, strange Jewish idioms that you get in New York or whatever. But I think they were speaking thoroughly Egyptian. And therefore, if you take that on board, then Hebrew must be Egyptian. It's a daughter language of Egyptian. So I did this dictionary looking at all the similarities between the two languages. And it's quite apparent that they are not only just similar, but they were the same. So if anyone wants to learn original ancient Egyptian, well, all you need to do is get a native Hebrew speaker, and they could probably do it quite well, because so many of the words are the same. So those are the strong links we get between, the Torah story and Egypt. It's quite interesting, really.
Thank you, Ralph.